Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I have the task of introducing this session, and the title of the session is Reforming the Stability and Growth Pact and the Future of Economic Integration. And we have 5 speakers: Catherine Devrie, Francesco Papadilla, Daniel Gross, Paul De Grauve, and Marco Butti. Each panelist will talk for approximately 20 minutes, and then there will be discussion, and all the panelists will be happy to take questions from the floor. So I want to make this story very short. Let me introduce Catherine Devrie, the first speaker. Catherine is Professor of Political Science at Bocconi University. She is also affiliated at the Vrije University in Amsterdam and associate member of Nuffield College at Oxford, and she's a member of the Dutch Academy of Sciences and of the Delors Institute. And her research focuses on some challenges facing the European continent, such as Euroscepticism, political fragmentation, migration, and corruption. And let me recall that she's written an influential book, Euroscepticism and the Future of European Integration. The title of our talk today is The Tricky Politics, Reforming the European Economy. So Catherine, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Patrizio. Thank you also for Claudio and Nino for inviting me and all the other panelists. I'm really looking forward to hear your talks. So rather than some distinguished panelists on this panel, I think have very particular ideas also about how to think about reforming the Stability and Growth Pact from an economic perspective. I wanted to really go quite big picture and outline the enormous political challenges that actually lie in negotiating this out. And I wanted to do that a bit in using the pandemic as a bit of a stress test as to where we are. To be fair, if you're a student of European integration, you might actually think that the Stability and Growth Pact is one of the least of EU's problems at the moment. So I wanted to give a little bit of a bird's eye view of the type of challenges and talk a little bit about what is the room to maneuver, and also maybe to open up a little bit of the black box of potential constraints that we see, and that there might be packages to be done in different areas. So, you know, it's going to be a little bit of a big overview to think about that. But I thought it was, you know, to talk about the politics of it, I thought to only focus on the Stability and Growth Pact maybe is not really capturing the key challenges. So I've prepared some slides, but I'll do it in a kind of, you know, I'm maybe much like the other panelists as well, as really still, you know, thinking through my thinking on these areas. So, you know, you will hear enough, I think, about the Eurozone as a building site and the extent to which we've seen structural imbalances grow between especially North and South after the last crisis in 2010, but also increasingly, of course, about if we think about, you know, the recovery that we're seeing now, or perhaps a stalled recovery, depending on what's going to happen in the current pandemic and the extent to which boosters are given in time, and what the kind of level of uncertainty is about the pandemic. But against this backdrop, I think these negotiations are taking place, but I think they're taking place against much, you know, bigger challenges when it comes to the EU. And actually what I wanted to do is to open up our discussion a little bit to think about, you know, is there actually within the Stability and Growth Pact, regardless of some particular details, actually perhaps more room to maneuver now in comparison to some other areas? But would we also see that the Stability and Growth Pact discussions could be taken up by other developments that are going on? And actually we'll see a lot of negotiations that are actually not only about the policies, but also about other things that are going on within the EU as such. So I think I wanted to think a little bit about the pandemic as being a stress test, then not only for the Stability and Growth Pact and the Eurozone, which I think many of the other speakers who are going to talk about a more economic perspective will talk about. But oftentimes that politics doesn't always allow governments to choose the efficient options that might be out there, or to choose some of the options that could deal with the issues at hand. And I think that a lot of my work is really about why have we seen so many suboptimal issues at the European level. And that's also one of the, when I was still teaching in Oxford, one of my questions to the students was always to what extent is the Eurozone a economic or political project? And of course, there was no right and wrong answer. There are both of these things are at play, but I think the politics of it have really overshadowed some of the kind of economic solutions that maybe some of my fellow panelists will talk about. And I think that we've seen this oftentimes in also post-2010. It's been a lot of work by colleagues of mine in the social and political science department at Bocconi, who've also highlighted that some of the extreme positions taken by some governments have some root in previous crises and the wave of populism that we've seen. But maybe there's been some recent discussion about if actually the pandemic has reduced some of these kind of populist forces within domestic politics. And I will talk a little bit about the extent to which I think that that's the case and what we could expect in that. Of course, in the Italian context, this has been an issue that is hotly debated, but also in the election that is still upcoming. I mean, in Italy, it will probably be 2023. We'll see how it goes with the president's renewal or extension, or whoever will become Italian president. But definitely we have the French election coming up, and we have the Hungarian election also coming up. So important domestic elections, and thinking about the political forces that we see will be crucial to also think about how government ministers are going to negotiate when it comes to the Stability and Growth Pact. A second element, I think, and that's a really big one in the US, you'll say a biggie for me, and that's the current rule of law crisis and the extent to which actually we could see an element of stalemate when it comes to some of these issues, particularly on the Polish government. And I will talk a little bit about that, but also the developments that have gone through. And then I think thirdly, I wanted to come back to the panel's topic and the extent to which these 1 and 2, so the developments of when it comes to more Eurosceptic populist forces at the domestic level and these rule of law challenges, which of course also really tackle the core of the treaty base, and the extent to which governments feel bounded by that treaty base will also affect the room to maneuver when it comes to European cooperation, and highlight a bit of that. I'm not going to give so much of data because I think this is an area where we are just also a bit extrapolating from what we know, but I'll try to give some insights in the way that I think a lens through which we can think about this. So just very quickly, so the way that political scientists often come to that first challenge when it comes to populism, the way that political scientists, especially my fellow countryman Klaus Müller, defines populism is often a combination of anti-elitist and anti-pluralist positions. So the idea that a society is made up of the pure people that have to be protected against a corrupt elite, and that politics should reflect the general will of the people, and both the pure people, the corrupt elite, and the people I put between quotation marks because these are often defined in particular ways and often in illiberal ways. For example, not respecting minority rights, or not expecting people who have dual citizenships, or not respecting people who have a different skin color than the dominant group within that society. Well, actually, I think a lot of the discussion that we've had previously, where we saw, let's think back, it seems like ages ago, but between the first Conte I government in Italy in 2018 and the Commission, when it came to that, when it comes to the extent to which actually Italy was meeting its Stability and Growth Pact conditions, that seems like quite a while away from the current situation in which we, for example, have a party like the League that has really decreased in support within Italy. Note that it doesn't mean that populism is on its way out. We've seen, of course, this being taken over by, this is not taking in most recent data, this was from the FT earlier this year, taken over by Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy. So it's not really gone away, but that particular moment of let's say, populism, a coalition between the Five Star Movement and the League, which for European integration and for Europe was a very difficult issue to deal with. Also, of course, for Italian bond managers, this picture looks very different now than it did at that moment in time. And actually, Italy especially currently has, of course, a technocratic government political technocratic government under the leadership of Mario Draghi, and it looks very different when it comes to the EU. We also interestingly find that in public opinion. So if you ask an average Italian about how they view the EU, that was a big drop-off at the beginning of the pandemic, where we're seen as less solidarity coming out of Europe. But since the recovery package, this has really changed. So actually you have some of the, in some of the opinion polling we've done, and we do that every quarter, we've seen about a 20 percent point plus increase of support among the Italian public when it comes to the EU. It also gives you a sense of how volatile these things are, right? This has not only been an Italian phenomenon. You've seen it in my country of birth, the Netherlands, where a party like Forum for Democracy didn't do that well. Actually, Mark Rutte, contrary to the expectations, still won an election. It's been a very difficult coalition period negotiation after that, but the populist right didn't do as well as it was predicted. The same we actually saw in Austria. We've seen also similarly in the German election. The French election is one to watch, of course, the extent to which we have one particular candidate, well, actually, I should be more precise. He's not declared his candidacy yet. Zemmour, who is clearly probably political scientists would not even call him populist, but would call him nativist or far-right candidate, has been very active. So that's also a thing to watch. Although most political scientists would think that if a candidate like that comes through the first round, it would make it actually easier for a candidate like Macron to win the second round, because even moderate people on the left would support Macron. But also the same goes for Italian politics. I wouldn't want to make very long predictions. The either hand I would want to do that about French politics. But overall, we see a very different image than we saw in the kind of 2010 period or controversial time after that, where a lot of actually these parties were willing to gain, were willing to articulate a lot of Eurosceptic stances, and were gaining in the polls. And now actually we see a kind of a flip side of that some of these parties are in serious trouble, or at least are being challenged by other parties, and therefore are being more fragmented than they were previously. Part of the explanation for why that might be the case, this is some work by Kerim Kavakli, who is a colleague at Bocconi, who's looked at the extent to which the health measures were introduced at the beginning of the pandemic. So this is, of course, last year, that populist governments usually waited much longer to implement any form of health response, also forms of other economic responses, but he shows in the paper. And this maybe in some countries has led to some discontent when it comes to especially populist parties when they're in government. This is from the entire globe, but he has looked at it particularly in Italy as well. In Europe as well, where basically, populism is not necessarily, or populist parties are not known to be necessarily the most competent political parties in leadership. And actually they thrive very well by anti-immigration stances or anti-EU stances, but perhaps not by providing a crisis response when it comes to a health pandemic. So there might be some signal of weak competence where voters are actually returning to some extent to the dominant parties of late and say, okay, maybe that I feel more safe with a center-right or center-left party taking care of government than a more extreme party that I might, in a time, in a different non-crisis period, would give my preference for because I'm anti-immigration or I have serious objections to sovereignty taken from the national level or shared with the EU level. They might look at it a little bit different within the crisis. Of course, the question will be how long the crisis will change and how much of the support programs are going to be kept in place and the extent to which that support for especially business owners or for also individuals is going to prolong. But I think the thing is that this has been a little bit also the story of when you read the FT or when you read The Economist, the idea that, well, maybe we're going back into some competence is coming back with a vengeance. Someone like Scholz won the election in Germany. Actually, Rutte did better than expected in the Dutch election. Maybe if also Macron wins the French election, it will be a story backwards. Oh, we're back to the kind of incumbents and they are actually doing well, and we see less of a move to the extremes either on the left or the right. I think we have to be very careful that we're not underestimating another process that's happening within many countries, and that is actually that in a time of crisis, political entrepreneurs often try to change the narrative, especially when that narrative makes them look bad. So I've done a particular amount of work on the extent to which in economic downturns, political entrepreneurs, which is, in political downturns, people often want some form of economic competence. A lot of populist left or far right, far left parties cannot necessarily provide that or don't have a strong record in that area. So the only way in which they can win an election is by changing the narrative and changing the narrative away of that competence story and actually making their anti-pluralist, anti-establishment attacks through that government. And that is also maybe some of the points you're seeing, especially actually in West European countries at the moment, in the north, of where that's changing. So we see quite a lot of populist left or right parties have taken on other issues, and the issues that they've often taken on, which is very similar to someone like Donald Trump in the United States, but the extent to which the crisis response is infringing on liberties of individuals. Think, for example, of the organization. It's not necessarily linked to politics, although it has clear links also with the Alternative for Germany. Querdenken in Germany, actually it's across the German-speaking world, where we've seen also vaccination rates not at the same level that people would have expected. And a lot of that has been socialized and mobilized by parties or by groups that are close to parties on the extreme left and the extreme right. From my own country, the Netherlands, here we see the take-up of vaccination rates, people self-reported ones. It's increased a little bit. This is the end of 2020. So, but this is already before we actually saw the full polarization over vaccinations. And here you see the FVD and the PVV. So those are the populist right parties. Also a little bit among the SP, which is the populist left party, where you see that vaccination rates are way lower than the general population. And actually this is decreased across time. So what you're seeing is that a lot of these parties are taking quite different narratives on the pandemic. And it's not to say that those are majority narratives, but this kind of idea of moving away from competence about health and moving towards another societal polarization or difference between people and us versus them, which we've often seen in immigration rhetoric, but we're also seeing it increasingly in rhetoric around what in some countries is called 2G or 3G, the extent to which there should be limitations on the rights of non-vaccinated people and the extent to which a state can oblige its population to get vaccinated. And I think this is a thing that shows that this kind of societal unease, which can often be mobilized in these us versus them terms when it comes to the EU, when it comes to immigration, but also when it comes to this kind of health response, we shouldn't underestimate. It shows that there is a potential of people who really are discontent with their political systems and can be swayed either way. And what we've seen in the immigration stance, that actually quite a lot of people could be swayed in that direction. With vaccinations, I think there's a natural ceiling. It looks like it's about 20% of the population at max that is open for these kinds of, or maybe 25 in this case of Austria, that are open for this kind of rhetoric. So it's definitely not a majority position, but I would like us to urge us to give a sense of this level of mobilization can be mobilized very quickly, with all the effects when it comes to the EU, again, when it comes to negotiations that will have to be put through at the European level. So another kind of challenge, and then I'll come back to the specifics of the Stability and Growth Pact or European cooperation more generally, is actually another, I think, a very important issue for the EU. Not just that there is this sentiment of discontent with governments that governments have to deal with, and that there will be a lot of challengers on the left and the right extremes that will challenge governments in what they negotiate also in Brussels. But we have a challenge from within. We saw these kind of extremist or let's say more vocal entrepreneurs in the British case. It started with Nigel Farage, it entered into the Conservative Party, and ultimately led to Brexit. That's actually something that the EU can deal with. It's a third country, and we can try to deal as much as we can with that. But we have a bigger challenge of particular parties that fall in the kind of more populist category that I talked about before, but that hold government and have consistently held government over the last couple of years and have challenged the EU from within. One of the biggest examples now, of course, is Poland, and this is not just about rule of law, but this is actually, I want to just cite also the Belgian Prime Minister, who gave a speech not so long ago at the College of Bruges, highlighting the enormous challenge that is in here, which is also at the core of democracy. We can have a very narrow interpretation of democracy, including free, fair election and a peaceful transition of power, but we usually, as political scientists, use a broader definition of democracy, which also includes minority rights and rule of law. And here we see key challenges, especially currently in Poland, where we've seen an increasing politicization of the judiciary, and that is, as I've argued elsewhere, not only about supremacy of EU law, so the extent to which the Polish government, via its highly politicized courts, is challenging the extent to which EU law should have supremacy over national law. But one also has to look more carefully at the Polish situation, in which the Polish government is using actually this as a smokescreen, because the part of the brakes on taking over full control of Polish society has actually been the EU and the European courts. So there are, this is not just about supremacy of the EU, this is also very much about the future of Poland in and of itself, and others have highlighted to this. Well, this is actually a fundamental crisis for the EU, because it's a fundamental crisis in the way that we settle issues at the European level, but also the extent to which we actually, if we make decisions about particular elements, to what extent can we expect, we have this level of contracting at the European level, to what extent can we expect that member states will actually oblige with those rules, or the extent to which they feel that they can negate on those rules. So it's not just about kind of democratic norms and liberal values, but it's also increasingly about how we cooperate together. Interestingly, you see that also very much of the strong opposition of the Dutch government, which has not as always been a proponent of more debt sharing or fiscal policy within the EU, but has been a very, very big proponent of defending rule of law, the extent to which when we do things together and when structural funds flow from the core to particular member states, that we should be able to know that it's spent well, and it's not spent to silence minorities, to circumvent rule of law, or to, for example, infringe on LGBTQ rights. So this is really about, part and partial among this. This is a cartoon. I don't know how much you follow the rule of law issue within the EU, but of course there was quite an interesting development that then after there was the decision on the rule of law mechanism and making rule of law conditions on funds that flow towards different member states. And of course, Hungary and Poland then went themselves to the European Court of Justice to carry that, to carry their objections, right? So it's a kind of also gives you a bit of an indication that from the Hungarian and the Polish government, this is also used as a kind of strategic way of dealing with their own internal issues and own internal elections looming. So what does it then mean for European cooperation? We have this salient, I think, a latent demand among the public for kind of populist thinking, us versus them, where the EU is often seen as the other, and the nation state is often seen as the us. So that is something that governments have to deal with, and they will have to find ways to settle those debates at home, which makes it also difficult for them to negotiate at the European level. Secondly, we have this challenge from within when it comes to the rule of law and when it comes to this particular governments, in this case of Hungary and Poland, where also the money that we will be spending on the kind of agreements that we make also in the area of fiscal policy, to what extent can we expect that those are going to be upheld by certain member states if they are actually threatening to, not uphold the acquis in and of itself. So what does that then mean for European integration? I think so. It is a tricky thing. And when it comes to thinking about the Stability and Growth Pact, I think what is very important when it comes to about the Stability and Growth Pact, that this is not only about how much EU coordination would you like to see. So, for example, a country that's not necessarily known for its lenient stance on the Stability and Growth Pact, or other forms of reforming the EMU or providing a fiscal policy element or pillar to the European Union, the Netherlands, actually oftentimes in its stances wants more EU coordination. It wants more the Commission taking a stronger role and actually look, for example, when it came to the recovery funds, and actually upholding and making sure that recovery funds are spent well. So this is really not only about the way you view the rules that you're being made, but the extent to which you think that coordination is powerful enough and that coordination is good. So it's not so easy to say that it's just about more or less sovereignty or more or less EU. It's much more complex than that. I think another element, which is also the face, which I think some of us have underestimated for quite a long time, is that we have different models of how we want to organize our economies in Europe. And so we see these clashing also, for example, when it comes to Stability and Growth Pact. So when it came to the Recovery Fund, for example, on the Dutch element, It was very much also the idea that if we would create some form of let's say, not backstop in the kind of Brexit negotiation, but backstop as in, if there's a default risk or any form of risk on some member state, the EU would ultimately come there and cover and do whatever it takes. That was also an element of where we would see less market and we would see more state intervention in the economy, which is something that is not necessarily something that most Dutch financial ministers or prime ministers are big fans of. And that comes out of that political ideology. So I think that's what is really important to understand, that you see really differences, not just on the level of policy coordination you want, so how much you want Europe to actually do, but also different models when it comes to how you want to see the EU to be followed through. So that would not only be a key element of the Stability and Growth Pact, it will also be very important when it comes to the discussions about strategic autonomy and how much industrial policy do you would like to see at the European level. So, for example, within Dutch circles, it's very clear that the Dutch position of having very limited industrial policy is probably a losing position, and they know that that's the case, but they find it very difficult to swallow to see other forms of coordinated industrial policy, which they would see a kind of statist idea that is much more close to a French model of thinking or to a German model of thinking. So it's really also about different models of how we're going to shape that economy, and they're playing out against each other. And I said already that you get these kind of interesting bedfellows where you might have, my prediction, a very strong negative view of the Dutch government when it would come to any negotiations on the Stability and Growth Pact. I would just say that the Dutch are then indicative of many of the frugal countries. However, when it comes to providing coordination and giving maybe coordination at the European level to actually enforce some of the arrangements that are there, they would probably opt for a very form of complete contracting where the EU would have actually quite a lot of leeway, which actually from an integration perspective gives more weight to the European Commission and is actually a further integrationist stance. So it's not so easy to kind of say that, for example, many of the countries of the North are necessarily always naysayers. It really depends on what you're looking at. So I didn't want to say so much about the Stability and Growth Pact in and of itself and what will be reformed, because many of the other panelists will do. I just wanted to kind of shed the kind of political challenges that are here, and also kind of make the point that the room to maneuver for many member states, governments and financial ministers are going to be very much shaped by the extent to which they find some more Eurosceptic or populist undercurrents in their countries, and the extent to which they can appease those or not by the stances that they will take also on this particular issue. You could say in one end, well, that's gone down now, so actually there should be a room to maneuver at the European level now more than any time to actually do some of those reforms. On the other hand, you could also argue that, well, because of some of the challenges that we've seen in the past, maybe some governments are not going to be that risk-taking when it comes to providing and giving in quite a lot when it comes to economic rules, which, for example, in the country that I'm originally from, the Netherlands, are actually quite salient in the public debate. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those that are always kind of maybe a little bit on the kind of skeptical side when it comes to these kinds of reforms are in and of itself anti-European or anti-EU. It's much more multifaceted than that, because in other areas, especially when it comes to thinking the extent to which we can actually enforce some of the rules and some of the arrangements that we collectively would decide at the European level, we would actually find some of these countries on the side of advocating for many more powers to the European Court of Justice, many more powers to the Commission when it comes to enforcing some of those rules. So it's an interesting kind of multifaceted process where a lot of this, I think, is going to be very much strained by domestic politics and how that develops. And I think post the outcome of the French presidential elections, we can't really say what's going to happen yet with this very important image. I hope this was giving you a little bit of an overview of the really kind of political trickiness when it comes to negotiation of a new set of rules when it comes to the Stability and Growth Pact. And I'm also happy to talk more specifically about those issues, but I will leave it to my other panelists to discuss that part. Thank you.
Well, okay, thanks, Catherine. I think Nuno is taking over now.
Sorry, I kind of lost my Okay, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
The next speaker is Francesco Papadilla. Let me briefly introduce you to Francesco Papadilla. He has an outstanding central banking professional life, first at the Banca d'Italia, and after that at the European Central Bank, where he became the Director General of Market Operations. He's currently a Senior Fellow at Bruegel and Chair of the Selection Panel of the Hellenic Financial Stability Fund. More importantly, Francesco Papadilla was the right person in the right place at the right time, because he was Market Operations Director General in 2007, between 2007 and 2012, which were crucial years for the central bank and the policies that were enacted at that time. So Francesco, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nuno. Let me share my screen. Let me say that I'm very happy that I've been invited to this webinar, and I look forward to the discussion. I will talk about monetary policy, which, as Nuno says, has been my professional area of expertise over the last 40 years. And I will try to tell you what I feel about this question. Is the European Central Bank ready for future challenges? And as I will go through my presentation, you will understand that my answer to this question is basically yes. The ECB has shown to be competent, courageous, dedicated to the common good, smoothly functioning, great leadership, great stuff, but there is something that makes this expectation, introduces an element of doubt in this expectation. I remain with my basic yes, but I also want to tell you about this element of doubt. And this element of doubt comes from reading two recent ECB documents. As I said, I'm a great supporter of the ECB, also for what he did since 2012. And Nuno told you that 2012 is the year that I left the ECB. So it's not only that I love what the ECB did when I was there, I kept loving and appreciating what they did even after I left. But I was somewhat underwhelmed by its two most important recent documents. And these two documents are a book that has recently come out, written by a team led by Massimo Rostagno, a team of economists at the ECB, Monetary Policy in Times of Crisis, a tale of 2 decades of the European Central Bank. And the other document that I liked, but I liked with some reserve, is the Monetary Policy Strategy that was recently approved and published by the ECB. Let me cover first the book of Massimo, Monetary Policy in Times of Crisis. And I like the book for not so good and good reasons. Let me start for the not so good reasons. I appreciate the positive quotation of the book that Tuomas Välimäki and I wrote on central banking in turbulent times. So this has to do with my vanity. I welcome the adjective of courageous for letting banks on August 9, 2007 to draw as much liquidity from the ECB as they wished, since I claim some merit in that action. This also has to do with my vanity. I also noted that the securities market program that I implemented at the ECB is not seen so negatively as in some other assessment. Again, vanity. Finally, reading the history of 20 years of ECB, which I personally shared for about 3/4 of its life, reminded me of the most intense years of my professional life. So that was also a reason to like the book. But I think that there are good reasons to like the book. The good reasons is the first good reason is that this is an admirable blend of historical narrative, empirical facts, economic and econometric analysis. And if you go through this book, you will find about 140 figures that make sure that what is written in words is substantiated by facts, is substantiated by analysis, is substantiated by econometric results. The second reason why, the second good reason why I like the book, is that it avoids the trap of saying that everything went well and that the ECB had nothing to learn in the 20 years of its existence. The book does admit that something did not go as well as it could. The interest rate increases of 2011 are recognized as being inappropriate. Let's call it a mistake. The so-called separation principle that prevailed at the beginning of the crisis, which maintained that liquidity analysis and the stance of monetary policy were not only distinct but separate issues, that is also recognized as having survived its initial usefulness. Maybe there is one issue where I find that the book could have been more open, and that is about the monetary aggregates importance in monetary policy. I think that that importance lasted far too long, even when it was clear that it was not helping monetary policy conduct. So I think that the book is a bit defensive here in trying to support the idea that monetary aggregates were useful for quite some time, while I think that they very soon lost their effectiveness. The third reason why I like the book is that it gives an insight into the inner working of the ECB with frequent references to the staff. If you listen to the presentation of the president of the ECB during the press conferences or to speeches, you are led to think that the ECB begins and ends with the governing council. Now, this book gives you really good insight on what is behind the governing council in terms of staff of the ECB, staff of the national central banks as well. And I think it substantiates what I said about one of the elements of strength of the ECB being its great staff. So these are the reasons why I like the book, but I want to say a little more about the book, and I'm a bit in trouble because it's 400 pages, very intense, and I only have 22 minutes to talk, so I decided to go for the Martian approach to assess 400 intense pages in a few minutes. And I assume that a Martian comes to the Earth. He is told to give an assessment of the monetary policy in the euro area, and he's given two pieces of evidence: the chart that you see here and the information that with some variances due to the 2003 and 2021 strategy review, the objective of the ECB is to keep in the medium term inflation at 2%. Now he looks at this chart. The blue line is a 2% constant growth of the price level. The brownish line is the actual price level, and the green trends are the trend until the end of 2013, and the trend prevailing since 2014. And what the Martian would say, there are very two distinct phases here. The first one, the non-shaded, was full success, very close to 2%. The shaded area, much less of a success. The average rate of inflation was less than 1%. So this would be his first assessment when given just these two pieces of information. And then the Martian is given yet another piece of information where you have here the rate of inflation divided by tenure of the president of the ECB, Dosenberg, Trichet, Draghi, and Lagarde. Then the Martian would say, well, the first two presidents were much more successful than the last two presidents in terms of keeping inflation close to 2% in the medium term. Of course, there were ups and downs, but on average, they were quite on the mark. So that would be another conclusion that the Martian would take. And then a third piece of information is provided to the Martian, as in this charter that is been built by my colleague at Bruegel, Zsolt Darvas. The thick red line is the actual euro area core inflation. And the spaghettis that depart from that are the projection for inflation that were provided by the ECB over the last some 7-8 years. And what you see is that constantly, systematically, the ECB thought that over time they would move towards the 2% objective, and systematically they did not. Of course, the situation has changed more recently, but for elements that I don't think have much to do with monetary policy. So one conclusion that the Martian would draw here, and I will touch on this later, is that the potency of monetary policy is limited. Not only the ECB did not manage to reach 2%, but it constantly thought that it would, and it did. And it did not. But the Martian, the economic course of the Martian is not finished as yet. And there are another two pieces of evidence that the Martian is given that make him changing his views. The first piece is the book of 20 Years of Monetary Policy, the book by Massimo Rostagno and colleagues. He goes through the 400 pages, and he is convinced that there have been very different systematic shocks in the first and in the second phase of the life of the ECB. He looks at the time when the most forceful monetary policy started, and he sees that this coincides with the difficulties of keeping inflation close to 2%. And he's convinced that indeed you cannot just compare the two periods. The two periods are very different, one from the other. And then the Martian is given another book, the book that Tuomas Välimäki and I wrote a couple of years ago, where we document the issue of the reduced potency of interest rate changes for monetary policy purposes. In particular, we say there were three underlying conditions for monetary policy to be effective. One was that the central bank could precisely control the short-term interest rate. The second one is that there was a solid link between the short-term interest rates and longer-term interest rates that are more relevant for the economy. And the third one is that the central bank could lower interest rates to whatever level it would need to pursue its objective of price stability. Now, these three conditions failed in one period or another. At a certain point in time, the control of those short-term rates became more difficult. The link between short-term rates and longer rates, because of the spread, became much more volatile. And the lower bound on interest rate meant that the ECB or the central banks in general were not free to lower interest rate as much as they thought was needed. And the Martian now would look at, again, at the book of the ECB, and would find out that the package of measure, negative interest rate policy, quantitative easing, long-term refinancing operation, forward guidance, produced, when it comes to inflation in particular, 1/3 of a percentage point additional inflation over the period 2015-2018. So you get the view that the tremendous, gigantic effort of the ECB produced 1/3 of 1% inflation more. So you get this is not evidence of potency. This is evidence of a dispiriting bang for the buck. And I think this is confirmed by a more recent publication in which it is said that 6 years of forceful monetary policy did produce in 2019 3/4 of additional inflation. Precious because the inflation was so low. Still not enough to reach 2%, and in relative terms, relative to the size of the monetary easing, quite dispiriting, quite pessimistic about the potency of monetary policy. Now, if you pursue this idea that notwithstanding the gigantic effort, the result in terms of controlling inflation has been meager, then you start to harbor a dangerous doubt. The dangerous doubt is that instead of the traditional view that you have a medium-term inflation path that is determined by a central bank, and then you have exogenous shocks that disturb this medium-term inflation path over the short term. So this is a traditional view, but you are led to doubt that this is the right view, and instead think that maybe the main inflation story take place outside of the central bank. And those who have read the book of Goodhart and Pradhan know that they identified demographic trends rather than monetary policy as a main determinant of inflation. Now, I must admit, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know where I stand. I stood for 40 years of my career as central banking on the first view, medium-term inflation path determined by the central bank and exogenous shock disturb it. But after having seen what has happened, not only in Europe, but in Japan, in the United States, in the UK, in Switzerland, in Sweden, I start harboring doubts about that view. And I don't know the answer, but I'm not closer of having reached an answer after having read the book, notwithstanding the great intellectual investment that has been put into it. And so I think this is a limit of the book. Then upon reflection, I say, well, maybe I was expecting too much. A central bank cannot intrinsically ever say that it cannot properly control inflation. So maybe that was an intrinsic limit of that book. Let me come very briefly, and I will not do justice to the ECB monetary policy strategy review. Again, gigantic effort. Just let me say that what is in it is great. I like it. I like whatever is in it. The symmetric 2% target, yes, very well done. Owner-occupied housing costs in the price level target, very good. More emphasis on financial stability, due. Climate change, yes, so the central bank should try and do what it can. Changing communication, playing the full range of communication tools from cartoons to working papers, overdue, not only addressing the cognoscenti, but also the lay people. So what is it? Is great. What I miss is exactly the same point that I made about the book of 20 years. Why I found no good explanation why the ECB failed its objective for a decade, notwithstanding brave action. I did not even find formulated the question whether a central bank can really control the rate of inflation. And I did not find any hope that things would change for the best because of additional tools. So where I'm left after having looked at these two books, at these two documents, and being underwhelmed by that, I remain with my initial view that yes, the ECB is capable of dealing with future challenges, but I also remain with my but. I also remain with my little lingering doubt. And if I think about the three possible post-COVID paths, The first one is return to pre-COVID pattern. Inflation and growth between 1% and 2%, lackluster, kind of mediocre, but not particularly bad macroeconomic performance. Stagflation, the worst. Inflation higher than 3%, growth lower than 1%. And hot economy, inflation and growth higher than 3%. Well, in each of these paths, there are concerns for monetary policy and for the ECB. In the first one, can really the central bank continue with this so forceful monetary policy easing? Is it not endangering long-term damages? In the case of stagflation, the usual dilemma problem: which bag to control, stag or inflation? To which to devote the monetary policy tool. And on the hot economy, you would think this is the best one. I mean, inflation, okay, you raise interest rate, and given that underlying growth is good, it's buoyant, you don't produce a recession. But can the ECB ignore debt, ignore the huge amount of debt and the effect that an increase of interest rates would cause to debtors, not only public debtors, but also private debtor. So again, yes, I believe the central bank is capable. The challenges are big, and the lingering doubt about the effectiveness of monetary policy makes me a little less confident than maybe I would like to be. And this is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, now thank you, Francesco. It is my turn to introduce the next speaker, Daniel Gross. Daniel Gross has been director of the Center for European Policy Studies and known as CefES for quite a long time, actually since 2000. And he has been advisor to the European Parliament, the member of the Advisory Scientific Committee of the European Systemic Risk Board. And also is in Euro 50 group of eminent economists. He is editor of Economia Internacional and International Finance and author of several books and a number of articles in scientific journals. His talk today has the following title: The news of the death of the Stability Pact might be premature. Not being a great fan of the previous versions of the Stability Pact, I'm quite curious about his talk, and so Daniel, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Many thanks, Patrizio. When I was preparing for this event today, I thought that it would be useful to think about why we have a Stability Pact and to think more fundamentally, economically, why we care about public debt. So my talk will be a bit different from the other contributions which we have seen so far, in the sense that I would like to concentrate on economic mechanisms. And my main point is simply that, let me just get it back here. I presume you have now seen my full screen. The starting point is very simple. We have now very high debt levels, which have increased further through the crisis. We have very low interest rates, and in academic terms, that's the famous R minus G, meaning that the interest rate is smaller than the growth rate, and therefore actually you don't really need to do anything about that. It goes away on its own if you just wait long enough. And my point is that this is wrong. And this is wrong for a reason which sounds technical, but actually one sees in action from time to time, which is that the cost of public debt is not just linear, it's not just a question of the interest rate you pay, and therefore it is convex. And then when you combine convexity with uncertainty, you get potentially very high costs from public debt. And these two elements, convexity and uncertainty, I would like to illustrate just to give a little bit of background why we care about that. If you look actually at the lessons of history, there's a nice paper by Paulo Mauro, and it basically goes to the question, if R is smaller than G, so if the interest rate is smaller than the growth rate, we shouldn't worry about that. That's what many people say. And then he looks at how many defaults there were in the past during periods during which R was smaller than G. And he finds that there's really not a difference. So as he put it, we cannot really sleep soundly with high debt just because we see that the interest rate is lower than the growth rate. Of course, that means you need something else to create debt sustainability problems. And that is basically because countries very often run unsustainably high primary deficits, right? So the first point in mind is you cannot sleep soundly even if R is smaller than G. And here I just show you, most people know this. This is the, actually, sorry, I apologize. This is G minus R, right? And you see that over the last 5 or 6 years, the growth rate of nominal GDP has been way larger than the nominal interest rate. So basically the entire developed world has a very high, if you want, beneficial effect from low interest rates. If you were to not even out 21, 22, you would see, of course, very large, spikes and downwards and upwards in the curve. But basically, what you see is that the R minus G difference is very favorable for all developed countries, and of course very different, as many people have said, from the 1980s and 1970s and 80s and 90s, when the Stability Pact was born, right? The Stability Pact was born here when real interest rates were high, or if you want, the growth rate was much lower than the interest rate, okay? Now, I will talk just about that generically, but let me just make one side remark, which is actually important for the euro area. If you look at domestic public debt, the interest rate the government pays is really not a problem for the country as a whole. Because if the government pays higher interest to domestic holders, they have higher income on which they may pay taxes, and they might demand more goods and services. So domestically, it is a wash. It is a problem, of course, for public finances. It might be difficult to raise the taxes needed to service the debt, but that's something else. For the country as a whole, there's no net income effect, so to speak. That is very different when your debt, your government debt, is held abroad. That means if the risk premium increases, the country as a whole becomes less rich, right? There's a terms of trade loss, if you want. You need to do a transfer to the rest of the world, a net transfer. This is actually something which is empirically important for the euro area, but let me not talk about that because then it gets into lots of other issues, but just keep that in mind. These concerns I'm raising about the sustainability of large public debts are magnified when a large part of the debt is held abroad. Now, let me give you one illustration of why public debt, the cost of public debt is convex. I'm addressing that mostly for those people who have worked on these equations a long time. And I just wanted to point out that it is actually in most very simple models that we use. And basically you start from the fact that the interest rate is equal to the risk-free rate plus risk premium, right? For today, this risk-free rate, let's say in the euro area, would be minus 50 basis points, and the risk premium for Italy about 100 plus, right? And now comes the second point, which is important, that the risk premium itself is a function of two elements: the debt ratio, debt relative to GDP, and the market risk aversion. I think some people have talked about that, that we have seen different degrees of risk aversion in financial markets, very high during the financial crisis. And Francesco has also discussed how the ECB has intervened trying to reduce it. I'm not talking in particular about these exceptional cases of financial market disturbance. I'm talking about more normal times when even there's a large literature, which some of you might know. One sees that countries with a higher debt to GDP ratio pay in general a risk premium. And now the simple point comes that the debt service burden for the country is the interest rate times the debt level. You put these things together, and you have the first part here, which everybody looks at in the R minus G, the risk-free rate by debt times debt, and forgets about the second part, which is that the risk premium increases with the square of the debt ratio. Right? So that is one example of convexity. There are others which one could consider. So that's my first very strong point, that the cost of public debt is convex. Not just taking this first part here is not sufficient. You might say for Germany, this part here is irrelevant, but I think this second part for Italy is very relevant, both on account of the square of the debt ratio and this factor here, the risk aversion, which changes over time, right? Right now it's very low, but it can change over time. And for the economist, the immediate implication is that the marginal cost of additional debt is not the risk-free rate only. It's the risk-free rate plus another term. So the marginal cost of debt for Italy is not what it pays right now on its debt, but it's actually much higher, because the more debt you accumulate, the more you pay also on your outstanding debt. I think that's one key element already one should keep in mind. It's not directly related to one's Stability Pact, but for every country on its own, it should take into account that the cost of debt is not just the interest rate you pay, but it is actually much higher. Here I have just basically summarized once more what I have said. If you increase more debt, you pay a higher interest rate on everything, and therefore the marginal cost of debt is higher than the interest rate. And the second point is also important here, the difference between the interest rate you see in the market, that's for Italy, it's now, I don't know how much it is, 100 basis points on 10 years. It's actually not the marginal cost of debt. The marginal cost of debt is actually much higher. And of course, the marginal cost of debt can be higher than positive, even if the risk-free rate is negative. That's quite clear. And here I've just illustrated that what is the debt service function of a country as a function, debt service burden as a function of the debt ratio. And you see it increases in a convex way. Whether you have a low degree of risk aversion or a high one doesn't change the form. It just changes, of course, the slope of the curve, right? And here I will come back to that in the next point, is that a very important parameter in this is the degree of risk aversion in the market, which central banks can influence at times, but there are also other elements which cannot be influenced. There's a financial cycle. Right now, this degree of risk aversion is very low, but there's absolutely no guarantee that it will continue to stay so low. And I would actually say that if you have a positive correlation between the risk premium and the risk-free rate. So if people get nervous in financial markets, the risk-free rate might go up, and also the risk premium goes up. That means that you have a double whammy on countries which have a high debt level. So this is on the side, if you want, of convexity, which has, of course, intertemporal consequences, because you have a danger of a debt spiral. If you have a situation, the starting point is a certain primary surplus or deficit, a certain interest rate, and everything is quiet, you might be just keeping the debt ratio constant. Imagine a small negative perturbation, debt goes up, the risk premium goes up, next period the debt will be higher, and you get a spiral which runs out of control. I have illustrated that here, how you have a dynamic, instability, depending on very small initial changes, either in the initial debt to GDP ratio, right here it's 1.5, so 150%, or 1.2, I think, 1.1. See, in one case it goes down, in the other case it goes off, right? This is another implication just of the pure convexity, even if you don't have any uncertainty. Now, let me come then to the second point, which I would like to make, which is that we always think in our models, or always, most cases, we have shocks and they're normally distributed, meaning the tails are really getting very, very low, right? And I'm asking myself, is that reality? And we just need to look at the last 10 years, right? To see we had 3 or 4 sigma shocks in the space of very little time. This is just an illustration of what history shows, that the distribution of growth has fat tails. Let me just illustrate that with one scatter plot, where I show the frequency of shocks to growth rates in standard deviations from the average. Right? So not the absolute growth rate, but the standard deviation of the country average over the last 150 years, relative to the frequency you should have if they were normally distributed. And what you see that actually at the center you have many more small shocks, right? Small shocks are very frequent, but unfortunately, negative, large shocks are very much more frequent than they should be according to the normal distribution. Here, 3.5 times, 5 times. And then you can do other things with that data. You can look whether they would actually, whether the tail here looks like a Pareto distribution. I have some supplementary material which I can show if you're interested. You can actually show that the distribution of growth rates, in this case I'm using the last 150 years from the Schularik database, looks like a Pareto distribution in the tails. Okay, so to make a long story short, as I said several times, you cannot just say, we have low interest rates and therefore who cares about that? I have given you one reason why. There's a recent paper here which gives you a essentially related reason why that should not be the case. The cost of public debt is likely to increase more than proportionally with the debt ratio, right? And that means that if you look at the cost of public debt, you cannot just look at the interest rate. That holds true for Italy, maybe not for countries with very low interest rates. Let's take Switzerland. But once you get above a certain level, which we can discuss, then it becomes very relevant. And the second point is you need to consider fat tail uncertainty. I mean, if you put the two things together, the likelihood of large shocks and the cost of a large shock being convex, then you see that a high debt level exposes you to very high risks. Morale for me is it makes sense to keep limits on debt levels. Where's the limit? Is it 60? Is it 100? Is it 150? I don't know. We can discuss. But for me, the key point is that to say we don't care about that anymore because of low interest rates is wrong, or rather it's very dangerous because there are large shocks around which could really derail us very quickly. That's my message. You're muted.
Patrizio, you have to unmute your.
Okay, yeah. Sorry. I thought I had no control on my own. So thank you, Daniel, for your presentation and also for the presentation right in time. And I'm sure there will be a second round of discussion. We can get deeper into the issues you have put forward. Nuno, it's your turn now.
Yeah, it's my pleasure now to introduce you to Paul de Grauwe. He's John Paulson Chair in European Political Economy at the London School of Economics. Previously, he was Professor of International Economics at the University of Louvain, Belgium. Quite interestingly, he was a member of the Belgian Parliament between 1991 and 2003, quite a long time. He was visiting professor to various universities, but even more interesting, he was visiting scholar to the IMF, the board of the Federal Reserve System in the United States, the Bank of Japan, and the ECB. Paul de Grauwe, the floor is yours. It's a great pleasure having you here with us.
Okay, thank you very much, Nuno, for these kind words. I'm very pleased to be among you and to discuss reform of Stability and Growth Pact. In fact, after listening to the three previous speakers who gave us very interesting insights, I must really tell you that I'm the first one who is actually going to talk about the subject of this afternoon. But this being said, I enjoyed the three previous speakers, right? They gave us important insights. But I will have a few things to say about that also. So I'm going to talk about reforms of the Stability and Growth Pact. And let me share the screen now. Share, oops, and then just a second. Okay, Rethinking EU Economic Governance. So I've kept the title rather vast. Okay, so let me start out immediately with some introductory remarks, namely that the reform of the fiscal rules, I think, has become inevitable, right? Of course, they will not die, they will not disappear, as Daniel told us. But what I would like to do is to formulate a few principles that this reform should take. One has to do with the numerical targets. I will argue that we should throw away these numerical targets, right? But then put something else there, which is essentially more sophisticated, namely that sustainability analysis. I will say a few things about bottom-up versus top-down, right? The fiscal rules have been very much top-down, and maybe the scope for doing more bottom-up things. And then I will talk in some detail about public investment, right? Both at the EU level and the national levels. So this is what I want to do. Okay, numerical targets. I think they have failed. Well, you know, these targets, right? 3% budget target, 60% government debt, and the structural budget balance rule, right? And these numerical targets have failed for a very simple reason. That is, they have no scientific basis. And intelligent politicians, and I can tell you, I was in politics for some time, most politicians are actually intelligent. You may doubt about this, And especially academics have the tendency to think that politicians are stupid, right? No, they are mostly intelligent people. And they will not follow numerical rules that have no scientific basis when they are under pressure because of a recession, for example, and they have to do something when literally millions of people are suffering. They are not going to be held back by the holy number 3 or something, right? This is not what they are going to do. So it doesn't make sense to use these numerical targets, right? I think this has become clear now in its 30 years of existence. We have had this dilemma several times. In fact, 3 times there were 3 recessions, right? 2002, 2004, 2008, 2009, and then now more recently. And each time these numerical rules were set aside, right? And as a result, they have now 0 credibility. By the way, I think now this is more or less accepted, at least among intelligent people. But now the new fad has become expenditure rule, right? We should keep the expenditure to GDP ratio somehow constant over the business side. This is also something that has no scientific basis, right? There's no reason why that should be the case. It might actually be that now with the climate problem, we have to increase the size of government spending. I'll come back to that when I talk about public investment. Right? Maybe we have to increase that. There's no reason why we should say, oh, well, the level of public expenditure that has been achieved now should somehow be frozen over the business side. That doesn't make sense at all, and therefore will not work either. So instead of these numerical rules, I think what we have to do is something which is more difficult in a way, right? Debt sustainability analysis. There is a large literature, and the European Commission, in fact, has done a lot of work on that too, about how you do that. This is essentially a scientific tool of analysis that projects the future expenditure and taxation and net debt levels, given the current forecast about interest rates, growth rates, inflation, etc. Right? And so it leads to much more sophisticated, but also less precise analysis, right? And we will have to live with that. I mean, precision can sometimes be an enemy, right? The precision of the 3% can become an enemy of sensible policies. Note also that we should refer to the net debt levels here, right? And I was a bit surprised that Daniel, when he did this great analysis on the debt level, actually only talks about the gross debt and not the net debt. Maybe he has something in mind that I missed there, but I will also come back to that. In other words, we also have to talk about assets that governments create when they issue debt, in the same way as we do with private companies, right? We will never, ever look at private companies' balance sheet and only look at the debt side, the liability side, and not on the asset side. We always look at both assets and liabilities, and therefore the same has to hold for governments, right? We have to look at assets and liabilities, but I will come back to that when I discuss public investment. So that's, I think, a move that should happen. It's possible. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be less precise, as I have argued, but it is necessary. Let me say a few things about top-down versus bottom-up approach. The approach that we have used up to now was very much top-down, right? So we have a whole structure there, and it has a very strong top-down content, right? Because it is the European Commission and together with the Council that monitor and try to push national governments in a particular direction. But we face a big problem here, which is that in a democracy, the power to spend and to tax is vested in parliaments, right? No taxation without representation. That's a very basic thing that we accept in democracies. And these parliaments then in turn are accountable to national electorates that can punish the parliament and the politicians that are in the parliament in the next election, right? And in the euro area, the power to spend and to tax is actually vested in national parliaments. And this creates a big problem. When a supranational institution or a series of supranational institutions tries to override decisions made in these parliaments, problems are bound to arise, right? And when the European Commission, together with the Council, pushed countries in a particular direction, they don't face the political costs of this pushing around, right? It's the national government and parliament that face these costs. And this creates a disconnect between those who take decisions and those who suffer the political costs of these decisions. And that, I think, is the major weakness of these budgetary rules in the euro area. I'm not saying that this is illegitimate. I mean, surely this whole thing has been decided and put down in the form of a treaty, and all countries have agreed to follow these rules. But the governance is not very good, right? When those who take decisions are not the same as those who actually suffer the political cost of these decisions. And when that happens too often, then conflicts will arise, and these rules will be set aside. There are two ways to solve this problem. One is to go all the way to political union, right? So let me now fantasize, right? We create a European government that is accountable to the parliament, and then you have it, right? And you have aligned again the decision-making with the cost, the political cost of this decision. But we are far from that. Of course, now the Next Generation EU program is the first timid step to go into direction, but we are still very far from that. And that leads me then to the default option, which is that, well, maybe we have to go more towards a bottom-up approach. And there is also a lot of thinking has been going on. There's a bottom-up approach, a renationalization of the budgetary governance, where we try to organize it from bottom up at the level of the nation states, with institutions like national fiscal boards that are given enough independence. And that would then be the model that we try to have, right? Until the moment when we have achieved full political union. So that is something that I would tend to favor, right? Okay, now let me come to my last point, but I will spend a little more time on this last point, and that's to do with public investment, right? And here I must say, yeah, some of these fiscal rules, in particular, the structural balance, budget balance rule, is an impediment for public investment, right? As it requires governments to balance the budget over the business cycle. And this implies that public investment cannot be financed by issuing of debt. Given the existential threat today posed by climate change, I think this is actually a rule that is irresponsible, because we will need massive public investment to make output and production more sustainable in the long run, right? More sustainable because it is more in connection with the environment. And this, if we were to maintain that rule, I think at some point when this threat from the environment and climate change becomes strong enough, sovereign nations and member states of the Eurozone in particular will reject these rules, right? It just does not make sense to tie our hands here in the face of such existential threats, right? And say, oh, we are not allowed to do the public investment that we would like to do because of this balanced budget rule, right? That really should be rejected. I mean, so that's why I'm saying we should really put absolute priority to that. And in this connection, it's the net that matters, right? When governments make public investments, they increase both assets and liabilities. And if the selection of these assets is careful enough and creating future returns in terms of more sustainable production, then there is nothing wrong with financing this by debt. And therefore, there should be no limit to this kind of debt, right? That's why I disagree with Daniel when he says, well, there is some limit here. Yes, of course, if it is debt to finance consumption, but not if it is debt to finance productive investment. Then there is no reason why we should say, oh, well, we should limit that. No, and therefore also countries today with high gross debt levels like Belgium, Italy, should not be restricted in issuing more debt if that is to finance productive investment, especially today in the context of the threat from climate change, right? So I think that is a very key point. And clearly, let me take that, what I said earlier, when we look at private companies, we do that. We never say in the abstract, your debt is too high, please do something about it. No, we say, we look at the asset and liability side and we say, oh, your assets may not be correct, may not be, not have the kind of future, expected future high return, and then your debt might be too high. But if that is not the case, then there is no limit to the debt that countries and private enterprises can have, right? In other words, if the expected return exceeds the costs of debt, then we should not impose limitations there. Okay. Yeah, I said, yeah, I want to say a few things about the Next Generation EU, a great initiative of European leaders. So it's great. It was not only great because it's an investment program doing the right things. It did it at the right time when we needed to create solidarity in the European Union. But of course, its macroeconomic impact will remain limited. When you spread it out over all these years, this may amount to something like a little more than 1% of GDP annually, which is still significant, but will not be sufficient to take up the challenges, right? And therefore, it will have to be complemented by national programs of investment. And let's face it, the capacity to borrow of national governments is a multiple of the European Commission's capacity to find own resources, right, in the context of its facility. So we have to garner both of them, right? Not only, not trying to say the following, oh, it's okay to do public investment in the Eurozone, but this should all go through the European channel. No, we need the European channel, but we also need these programs at the national level because that's where the capacity exists to create that to use for productive purposes. So this should be a two-pronged approach, therefore, right? The Commission continues to do that, what it does, and it makes sense, great sense, but it should be complemented by that finance through national channels. And then I come to the golden rule, which has been discussed a lot in the past already, where we have a situation where the current budget, we would apply some sustainability analysis or sustainability analysis to the current budget, also to the capital budget, of course, but that would be spending, capital spending that is financed by issuing debt, right? Oops. Yeah, let me go a little further. There's, of course, the issue that is important, how to select productive investment projects. That will remain an issue here, right? We have to be careful. It's not easy. There will be a lot of push of national governments to try to manipulate this and call some spending productive and investment, while it has very little to do with it. So it's not an easy task, right? I don't want to minimize this. We will have to deal with this, but it's not impossible. And in fact, the proof is now given by the European Commission itself that in the context of the Next Generation EU has been involved in selecting productive investment projects, right, that national governments present to it. So it can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done. And the European institutions have the expertise to do that and can use that for good reason. So one could envisage the national governments formulating this public investment project and the European Commission given the kind of approval to these, and then also creating the possibility for these national governments to fund these investments by issuing government bonds. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. It's now the turn of the last speaker today, Marco Buti. Marco is currently Chief of Staff of the Commissioner for the Economy, Paolo Gentiloni. He has been former Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the European Commission. And he has published extensively on the Economic and Monetary Union, the political economy of European integration, and on macroeconomic policies and on governance of the European Union. So, Marco, the floor is yours for the usual 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrizio. Nice to be here with you. I have a rule that one has to diminish, at least a rule I apply to myself. One of those not very intelligent rules, according to Paul, but I apply to myself. I reduce the number of slides depending on the ranking in the panel. So, and usually each ranking thing I reduce it by 2. So I started with 10 and I ended up with 2 slides since I'm 5th in the ranking here tonight. But it would be nice. It was nice to hear Paul and to come just after him, because you know, I felt at times you know, being part of the non-intelligent people, which you know, may be empirically also very founded. But okay, I present my 2 slides anyway. Now I think just to say, just let me say something to Paul on the Maastricht numerology. You know, while I agree with him on you know, several things he said, not all, obviously, but I think of the numerology, I mean, the empirical analysis, IMF, European Commission, you know, other economists, which actually show that the 3% had a magnetic impact in the behavior of policymakers, and policymakers, they do care about the 3%. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for less good reasons, but of the whole architecture, which has become very complex, you know, akin to what sometimes I've you know, called you know, a complete contract. I think the 3% is the one that actually stands out as making a difference. So the issue here, it seems to me, is not so much the fact that you have an anchor of some sort, it has to be a simple one, but it's the reaction function when you violate that anchor. That, I think, is the key issue. So what you do is, in case you violate the 3%, you have to assess, is it for good reasons, is it for bad reasons, and what to do accordingly. So that is I think in my view, a productive way of looking at these. This obviously changes a bit the nature, which instead of becoming an absolute threshold, it becomes a reference. It goes back to be a reference value, which was the way it was actually designed in the treaty. So this is, say, one way of looking at this. And what I would like to say, and I was not connected fully before, so I'm not sure that someone said it at the very beginning. We are undergoing a review of the governance framework, because not only the Stability and Growth Pact, but also the other coordination rules that we have, frameworks that we have in the EU. So I very much welcome this opportunity here, and also I invite you all collectively or in variable geometry to contribute. The online consultation goes until the end of the year. We have 11 questions, and obviously one has the possibility to upload papers, etc. This was relaunched 2 weeks ago by the Commission after it was initially launched on in February 2020, and then it was put in the freezer for obvious reasons, shifting to crisis management, to a crisis management mode, and with Next Generation EU and all the rest. And I mean, maybe at the very last point to Paul, the general escape clause that we have applied is part of the rule. It's not something that is an aberration that we just brought in out of desperation. It is actually part of the rules. So when you have shocks which of this sort or a different sort, it can be triggered. That's what we did back in March 2020. Now, let me see if I can share my slides with you. So they are the two. Now, okay, hopefully you can see it. Can you confirm that you see it?
Yes.
Some nodding, so it's okay. So basically, what I'm trying to do in this in the next minutes is to illustrate a point that I think is important and essentially is about the future of Next Generation EU and the central fiscal capacity. The arguments that you find in my talk here, they actually come from a recent paper, a CPR policy insight that I published with Marcello Messori, where we look at what we call vertical coordination. So coordination from the EU budget and the national budgets. So I think one way of looking at these issues, which I find promising, is to look at this via the policy mix trilemma, which I try to illustrate in this triangle here. Now, the original and most celebrated trilemma in economic and monetary union is the one of Mandel, Mandel-Fleming, Padua-Schioppa, free capital mobility, fixed exchange rate, independent monetary policies, and you can choose the combination of two corners of the triangle, not the three. We know that trilemmas are more or less, let's say, compelling. That was, the one of Mandel was pretty compelling until he wasn't. And you had a few years ago, Helen Ray actually challenging the trilemma, reducing it to a dilemma in the case of international financial cycle. So when you have international financial cycle, even with free floating exchange rate, you cannot have an independent monetary policy. So even that, which pretty solid analytically, has been challenged. So the trilemma here is, I admit already, so I plead guilty in advance, is less compelling in the first place. But I think it helps to describe with the policy mix over the 20 plus years of EMU. So basically what this policy mix trilemma says, that you cannot have at the same time asymmetric, what I call here prescribing fiscal rules, prescribing meaning that preventing some behavior to be done, something that that prescribes instead of prescribe. So of the fiscal rules that we have in the Union, you cannot have that plus a monetary policy which is constrained by the zero or the effective lower bound, that's the second corner, and no central fiscal capacity. So basically, the way the trilemma has been solved over the first 20 plus year of EMU is the way I think you describe the evolution of the policy mix in economic and monetary union. So in the first 10 years, what was the rather benign years, you see that on the right-hand side, what we had is that we had no central fiscal capacity, obviously not part of the Maastricht Treaty or the Stability Pact. We had the Stability Pact biting at the time, but that was very much helped by the fact that monetary policy was not constrained by the zero lower bound. So in a sense that was the way we solved the trilemma. We dubbed this in the paper weak monetary dominance. Why weak? Because at the end of the day, you have, and you can see there described in the on the line of the triangle, we had the convergence bonus, we had good growth. So in a sense, fulfilling the Stability and Growth Pact in the first 10 years of EMU, in a sense, was easy because you had, convergence of interest rate down, a lot of saving on the interest burden, and de facto that was, the rules could be satisfied without too much structural effort at the end of the day. So this was the way first 10 years of EMU, the trilemma was solved. The second 10 years, which is essentially after the Lehman Brothers and the global financial crisis and sovereign debt crisis, you can see that this was essentially solved by doing away with the prescribing fiscal rules strictly enforced. So there, what we had, we still didn't have any central fiscal capacity. Monetary policy was progressively pushed towards the zero and then crossed the zero lower bound to go into the effective lower bound. So they had two constraints: no central fiscal capacity and lower room for maneuver for monetary policy. And the room for fiscal policy was found by making the pact more flexible. This was an overburdening of say monetary policy, flexible SGP implementation, and we dubbed this what we call here sui generis fiscal dominance, because it was fiscal dominance, but fiscal dominance turning Sargent and Wallace on their head, because fiscal dominance came out on not supporting sufficiently the central bank in the face of a large demand shock. So in a sense, fiscal dominance was because we pushed the central bank back against the wall by not supporting sufficiently demand via fiscal policy. And we know that after a period of congruent policy mix at the very beginning, 2008, 2009, in 2010, we declared victory, and that was proved, far too early for withdrawing the support. So this was the first 10 years, the second 10 years, and then we come to the current crisis. And the current crisis, actually, we have solved the trilemma through the way you see here, which is essentially by creating the central fiscal capacity. So in at least on a one-off, large, persistent one-off basis, which is Next Generation EU, and that was accompanied also by the General Escape Clause and obviously all the the monetary policy, which still constrained at the zero lower bound, actually crossed even more the red line and went into the PEP. So this was, say, the way we actually we're dealing with the trilemma in the current crisis. Okay, next generation EU, I think, is largely recognized as being a very important institutional innovation. It is actually, and there are papers, including by the European Central Bank, actually showing that a next generation EU, together with monetary policy, it actually helped to avoid the financial fragmentation which haunted the Eurozone during the financial crisis, even ex ante. So it was the fact of showing that there was the member states, the European Council could take important, courageous decisions to respond to the crisis, that actually appeased the financial markets and avoided the resurgence of financial fragmentation, which hampered the functioning of the Eurozone during most of the financial crisis. And the way, and here Paul mentioned it in his intervention before, the support has, through Next Generation EU and the Recovery and Resilience programs, has been also to try to direct the resources to what would help not only in the short to medium term, but also to help the double transition with constraints on resources for allocation resources, at least 20% for the digital transition, at least 37% for the from the green transition. So Next Generation EU, yes, but it is a one-off, a very large one-off, a one-off that is not 1 year, but several years, 26, 27, but it is nonetheless not a structural change. So the issue comes here that if one looks to the future and you have and you want to solve the trilemma through the right angle, through the right corner of the triangle, then the issue of a central fiscal capacity comes to the fore. It has come to the fore in the past. Now, in a sense, it comes to the fore even more presently in the next period. So here is my second slide, and in my second slide I give examples. They say again, I list 3 options for design of a central fiscal capacity. So how this vertical coordination, so between the national level and the EU level, could actually take shape. So, and we have basically 3 options at the first order of magnitude. And one is to actually take care of the stabilization function. So that is a central stabilization capacity. The second one is through supply of EU public goods. And the third is, in a sense, to make the RRF, so the Recovery and Resilience Facility, persistent, permanent, also in normal times, not only in exceptional circumstances. Now, if one wants to loosely apply Maastricht 3-pronged approach to government, then you can say that the first approach here is more of this, dealing with the stabilization function. The second one is more on the allocation function. And the third one, since the RRF is redistributive, is more of the redistribution function. Obviously, this is not very scientific and very codified, because you can have clearly, if you supply your public goods, you also take care of stabilization because you support demand. And on the RRF, if you address the resources to the right spending, you take care also of the allocation issue. And what you can find here in the rest of the table, the 4 columns here, some considerations on, let's say, the pros and cons or the degree of feasibility from different standpoints. So one is the legal, let's say, institutional compatibility. On the legal compatibility, I have to say, and Danielle and I were this morning in a different seminar, and there the lawyers told us, Giuliano Amato, very clearly that you cannot take the TELCEL, the legal basis of the RRF now, and reproduce it for the future, because that is based on Article 122, which is for emergency situations. So one can be creative, but there is an issue of the legal compatibility. So so here you have some considerations on this. If I take the RRF, actually, some of you may remember the proposal back in end of 2013 or 2013 by Herman Van Rompuy when he was president of the European Council, when he proposed the contractual arrangements, and it would be basically reviving that type of proposal. So on the political feasibility, here also some consideration. There is the interplay with the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. I think here there is a trade-off, and the trade-off is that if you want a central stabilization capacity, I think you have to accept to devolve some sovereignty more at the central level. This applies in general, it applies in particular on the central stabilization. So it would mean that you will have stricter enforcement at the national level. So this is, you cannot have a free lunch from the political feasibility viewpoint. On the supply of public goods, this is the current multi-year budget is fixed until 2027. So the likelihood of this is low in the short term, probably high or higher in the medium term, considering precisely the type of public goods that we need to supply in order to respond to especially the green transition. Incentive structure, I don't go through all this. Incentive structure, I think there is an issue of moral hazard for the first. On the supply of public goods, there is how you articulate what you supply at the central level and what you supply at the national level. So there is an issue here of micro vertical coordination, and on the keeping the RRF in normal times, one actually to accept quite a large degree of intrusion in national budgets by European institutions, as we see now with the next generation EU. And the difficulties or pros and cons on the technical design, I think on central stabilization, the issue of eligibility, what are the conditions to be eligible for this? The issue of automaticity is important. Identification problem for the supply of public goods. And one advantage of the RRF in normal times is that one could use the existing RRF infrastructure that has been put in place to implement the current RRF. So I don't put my, let's say, degree of probability, that maybe we can leave that for the discussion on which ones of the three options here, or maybe a fourth one, could have a chance, if at all, to materialize in the future. From the point of view of, let's say, Euro area approach, the natural one would be a central stabilization capacity. I think any currency area has, a central budget to respond to stabilization needs. From the point of view of the green and digital transition, so looking at a more sustainable growth model for Europe, possibly the second one is the more conducive to that type of response. If one is like Danielle, deeply skeptical of the wisdom of politicians to rein in then their instincts, Maybe the third one may be the best one because we have a large degree of, let's say, conditionality in the way we would implement that. So the degree of skepticism on, say, human nature will, in a sense, affect probably the degree of probability that you attribute to these three options. And here I stop. Thank you.